I've often thought, and we've turned these iPhones over, and most of these phones so frequently, and I don't just say this as someone who really doesn't have the budget to spend all that money every year, but even if I did, I just, do these things need to be complete boffo sales leaders every time they come out? Partially because, as you say, they're only slightly different. But just because, do we really need to change this over that much? And I wonder if even a small patch where we didn't really hit a recession, but consumers were cutting back because of inflation, if that doesn't just stall a company like Apple out for a while, simply because as much as we love these things, we don't have to buy the new one in order to be very productive and very social with our friends, etc. So I just wonder if there's a whole paradigm in there of why do we need to keep upgrading this frequently? And obviously, Apple, I think, sees that they're really leaning on their services, and that was a big, profit leader this time around, and it's making a lot of money. And so I think they realize, as much as the consumer, that habits are slightly changing when it comes to desperately needing the new thing.
Welcome back to the Silicon Insider podcast. Hey, Scott, you look like a man out in the rain in Silicon Valley covering a story this afternoon.
Yes, actually, it did rain a little bit on us, but not all that bad. Not all that bad. We need it, as we always say here.
So let's get into it. Apparently, the bundle is back. I mean, even you are old enough to remember when cable TV, the deal was you could buy a bundle. They would bundle stuff together, including a whole bunch of junk to look like they had a really impressive listing, when most of the time you listen to the same three stations. Well, apparently, that's why streaming video got started with all these different stations, different companies backing them. Well, apparently those days are about to end, and we're going back to the bundle. I'm looking here. Verizon's going to offer a $10 bundle for ad-supported plans of both Netflix and Warner Brothers. Discovery's Max streaming services will be offering more than 40% in savings with their bundle. Verizon's also looking at bundling that combines ad-free Disney Plus along with ad-supported tiers of Hulu, ESPN Plus, Netflix, and Cinemax for $20 a month. So we're back to the bundle. And even if you don't like those streaming services, you're going to end up paying for them in one way or another. What do you think? Back to the future? I think into the past?
Well, right. But I think it makes sense. We got to a point where everyone was streaming kind of individually. And while a lot of people were attracted to cord cutting, and I get it, if you got Netflix and then Apple TV, and maybe you threw an Apple TV Plus, and then you add Hulu or Peacock and HBO Max and all these things, eventually that dream of saving money by not paying the cable company and just going to the individual streamers added up to the point where you were paying a lot of money anyway. And so I think the idea of bundling, it may be a little awkward now because you're accepting what like Verizon or another media company is giving you. But eventually, I believe we'll be able to bundle what we want as far as the streaming companies. And that will at least feel like we're spending less money on 7 different choices each night. Because if you think about it, you sit down to watch a movie, and if you have 4 or 5 different streaming services, it can be exhausting just to find something. And it makes sense to bundle to at least say, here's what we've got, here's the content we have to choose from, as opposed to trying to search through 7 different things that maybe we're paying for but not really using anyway.
Well, I wonder if it was the same at your house, where you get this message, you get an email at the end of a month, and it says your subscription is about to run out in about 4 different platforms. And you sit down and you go, when was the last time I actually watched something on Netflix? And so you go ask your kids, and they go, nah, they don't have any good new movies anymore. So you go, okay, buy Netflix. But if they were all bundled together, you go, yeah, what the hell? I'll get Netflix. I'm not paying for it. At least in my mind, I'm not paying for it. And it's there. And those companies have a chance to maybe re-earn my allegiance. So it can work for that.
Right. I mean, remember once sort of cable companies took over as the big media companies, they would bundle individual stations together, right? Individual networks and things like that. And then you had, well, we'll add Dish Network, or we'll add something, the NFL network. But now even Disney is spinning off, talking about spinning off some of its properties, and is ESPN going to be its own streaming thing and all that. So I think now maybe it would behoove the cable companies, as they try to stay relevant, to bundle some of the streamers. And so we'll probably see some consolidation. As we know, streaming is hot. It's everything right now, but it's also very expensive. And some of these companies are trying to make a profit while they stream. So maybe consolidating, bundling, however you want to call it, to put all this content forward and maybe try to convince the user on the household end that we can justify paying all this money for this content, and everybody wins.
I think it's telling that streaming right now is really expensive, and yet the content providers, the services are saying we're not making any profit, which suggests they have no choice but to start bundling now, because they can't charge. If they continue raising the rates on us, we're going to walk away, and there goes their. So it's time has come, I guess.
Yeah, I think they have to do something to figure out how to both come up with all this great content, and which costs a lot of money, and somehow on the other end make a profit. And maybe this part of it. And in every industry where you see many, many companies competing, all trying to turn a profit, you often see consolidation. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's what we're sort of heading into, at least in the short term.
Yeah, shakeouts are the nature of tech. Okay. This is, I promise, the only Elon Musk story today. And it's going to be not really Elon Musk, SpaceX. Remember, SpaceX, or Elon said, SpaceX has no plans of ever going public, right? That was a few years ago. Now he's initiated discussions about selling insider shares in SpaceX. You want to guess what he values the company at based on the price of these insider shares?
I believe I saw it was something like $175 billion, right?
$1 billion. Yeah. Which is more than most of the companies we know out there. I mean, it's bigger than Disney, for example. That would instantly make this 13-year-old company one of the most valuable companies in the world. Do they deserve it? I kind of have to say yes myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think if SpaceX were to go public, it would see that kind of gargantuan valuation. And at the same time, even if it doesn't, it makes sense to free up some of the, investor money, some of the shares, so that those who have been invested can take some money off the table. You sometimes see that in these companies that stay private for so long. Yeah.
And the insider shares and all that, you raise a little capital too, because the company can sell some of it too. And they given their ambitious plans, they're going to need more capital. Elon's pockets are deep, but they aren't that deep. So I think it's a good thing. I mean, I don't know anybody that doesn't think that SpaceX has done an astoundingly good job in just a short time. And we're literally used to watching rockets land, and they're going to be landing on the moon very soon. It's just thrilling. It's one of the good things in our world right now in a very messy time.
Right. I mean, they've been really, firing is a bad pun, but firing on all cylinders for a long time. They've got the satellite company that on its own is said to be worth billions if they spun it off. They're even getting business from Amazon. And remember, Amazon's founder started a competitor. That's how ingrained SpaceX is at this point. It's got a lot of government contract. That's always consistent money. They're really in a sweet spot.
They are. And NASA is never going to be a competitor again. It looks like Amazon is not going to be a competitor for a long time. Maybe the Chinese, but they're having their own, challenges. So it's great that we have this. It's great that we're exploring elsewhere. I mean, when we start looking at getting close-ups of comets and meteors that might hit Earth. The idea of maybe having a back door out of here is comforting. I have to admit, keeps me optimistic. All right, next, OpenAI CEO. You mentioned last week that he got kicked out. We still don't really know why, do we?
No, not entirely. No one is really speaking out on that. And I've seen some really, really impressive journalism that has gotten at some of this. But it's either that the former board is keeping some stuff to themselves, or it really was kind of specious. And maybe they didn't even know in a concrete way what they were doing. It does seem unimpressive that they stepped forward and did this, and it really put the company in a lot of chaos for a decent period of time. I think there were a lot of people who saw their livelihoods potentially crumbling.
And this is a guy who got CEO of the year, 3 times in a row. I mean, he was looking like the next great tech baron, and a leader in that marketplace. And then he's gone, and now he's back, which is something you also never see. I know Bob Iger came back after a couple of years, but you're fired from this screamingly fast-growing company that's become the new metaphor of our time, and then 2 weeks later you come back.
Right, and this wasn't even.
I know the business world is speeding up, but it's not speeding up that fast.
No, this wasn't even like a Bob Iger comeback. Or remember, we've seen companies like Disney, Starbucks, with Howard Schultz, where the founder comes back because he's dissatisfied with, whoever he left the reins to. This is more like, a Steve Jobs thing, where he was thrown out and then brought back and, by people who were like, the company's just not the same without you. And I think they were thinking that about Sam Altman and OpenAI. And I think that a lot of credit goes to Satya Nadella and Microsoft for somehow making.
At Microsoft, they were like, oh, we got him back. I mean, because they bet the store on this. Well, actually, so did Mark Andreessen as well. Put in 575 million or something. I mean, they put a lot of money into the future of chat, and now the CEO, the guy who built it, is on his ear. There must have been a lot of rough phone calls.
Oh, and think of the employees who, okay, they're well paid, but the equity they had in that company would be life-changing. And if that went away because of a disagreement between the CEO and the board, I mean, that would be, for them, a real tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he's back. We'll see. How long has it gone? 5 days total? Something like that.
Yeah, it felt like a longer time than it was.
It's like slightly more than 100 hours.
Right.
So, okay, well, we'll see.
And that's what the book will be called.
Now, New York Times had an article about how a lot of companies have been, not only big companies are laying off people and cutting costs, but an awful lot of startups have now reached that point where they got their money coming right off of the lockdown. Now they've burned through, their A round, and they don't have the product, or they haven't proven the marketplace or whatever, and they're starting to die. We're starting to have another one of these startup die-offs around here and around the country. What does that portend? I mean, short term, it's kind of going with the weirdness about the economy, but long term, when you lose a generation of startups, then you have this period 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 years from now where you don't have a lot of really great companies because they were stillborn. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things. One, we really are at a strange point for IPOs, and that is a strong stock market, also a strong crypto market. In other words, a couple of things that show investors are very willing to take risks with their money. And that traditionally leads right into big IPOs. But the IPOs that we've had over the last year have been really, really bad in terms of day 2 and beyond, that we just haven't seen in a long time. Even the exciting, sexy ones just have not continued to grow. And that's a surprise. So for some reason, we are in a kind of, I don't know, sort of a purgatory when it comes to IPOs. And I don't know if that's going to change the marketplace or whatever. The other thing is the more traditional exit, which is large companies buying startups, seems to have slowed a little bit.
A little bit.
Not terribly, but a little bit. And I wonder if that's because, you just referenced the pandemic. I wonder if these big companies are still trying to figure out how big they should be, how many workers to hire or lay off, and therefore how many companies to buy at the same time.
And I also think they're trying to think ahead because things are so unpredictable right now in terms of the market, in terms of the economy, that they're saying, yeah, we could grow fast. Or the VCs are saying, yeah, we could start throwing money at some of these new startups for the next round. But maybe we ought to just kind of pull back and be a little careful for a few more months. Maybe till after we see what the Christmas shopping numbers are, what the next quarter numbers are, what the election looks like next year. I mean, they may be playing very close to their chest with their money.
Right. I mean, every, say, Crunchbase or VC report I've seen lately has shown a fairly consistent drop in what is getting funded, other than AI, which is simply red hot. But other than AI, VCs, like you say, seem to be playing it close to the vest. I don't know if that's a long-term trend, but it is a little unusual in a strong stock market, a strong labor market, and even a comeback with some of those tech companies that did lay people off. But maybe there's still that cloudy future and no one's willing to jump in right now. And that does hurt that appetite for risk that an IPO kind of demands, right? Hey, we're not a fully formed company, but we want public equity to become that. So take a risk on us and you could be extremely handsomely rewarded. But on the other hand, you may not be.
Look at the recent IPOs, which is, the NASDAQ checkered flag comes down and they're at the starting line and they go about 12 feet and they run out of gas and they just sit there. Yeah. Okay. Well, there is one company we've been talking for the last year and a half that the hottest company in Silicon Valley is NVIDIA, but they just have been superseded by one of the oldest companies in Silicon Valley, AMD. AMD is on fire right now, and this week especially, because it looks like we have several big companies that are looking at going with AMD's new AI chip rather than, let's see, who is it? It's Microsoft and a couple others. I'll find it in a second, but AMD is starting to pick up the design wins over NVIDIA. And as a result, I think NVIDIA slumped, 2.4% this week. AMD stock up 10%. This is founded in 1969, 1970, right in there by Jerry Sanders and his crowd. It's on top of the game. The perennial also has been at near the top for the last couple of years now under great management. And now it looks like it may get the hottest market in the world.
Yeah, I mean, the market is really, really strong for AI chips right now. And credit AMD's leadership, CEO Lisa Su. We've talked about her a lot. Rock star right now in the chip world. And it's interesting because I think this helps AMD more than it hurts NVIDIA. NVIDIA is making and selling everything it can. But, that's sort of almost Wintel dominance. If you remember the Wintel, where the hardware and the chips, and it was all Intel, and then others started to chip away. NVIDIA had kind of that for the AI game. And it makes sense for someone to try to get in there and say, look, there's so much appetite for these chips. And AMD is making a great move. And boy, were those investors rewarded by that move this week.
Yeah. Lisa Su has said, quote, AI is absolutely the number one priority of AMD, unquote. And
that
boy, the world hears that. Okay, well, it looks like they're going to keep it up for at least a couple more years. They're expecting a growth rate of more than 70% for the next 4 years. That's an impressive number for a company that's more than a half a century old. Once again, she is the best CEO in Silicon Valley. I think it's almost unquestioned now. She has taken this company to the top for the last 10 years, and now she's at the summit. She really is at the top of Silicon Valley and at the top of the food chain. It's
yeah, and AMD is now worth $200 billion and plus in market value. That's some 30 or 40 billion ahead of Intel. You know, there was a time when that would be an absurd statement. So credit to her, credit to the nimbleness, and really, we don't often talk about a company that old and the word nimble at the same sentence. I mean, Microsoft has been able to do that under Satya Nadella, and I think AMD under Lisa Su is also being nimble at noticing these trends and really pulling off quite the coup to get some of these big companies that are jumping into AI to say, we're going to think about AMD's chips. And, you know, that is the world coming to Santa Clara, right? I mean, you've got your NVIDIA and AMD. They're within miles of each other.
Center of the economic world right now. No,
yeah, there you go. Absolutely.
And these are two big companies, and one a really venerable company that managed to look light-footed and make the turn fast. I mean, up until a few years ago, we had never seen anything like that. You know, I think it began with Jobs turning Apple 2 or 3 times over the course of a decade. Now we're seeing companies that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars that are so nimble, they can enter into a new market in a matter of months and go all the way in. That's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, and that's rarely seen in the chip world. So extra credit to her and to AMD, because they're really they're really moving quickly where we just haven't seen Intel able to move that quickly at all.
Yeah. Okay. So we mentioned Apple. We'll close with a couple Apple stories. One of them is Steve Hotelling, a senior executive at Apple, apparently is leaving the company. The company isn't talking about it, but he is one of those guys under Steve Jobs that never got into the limelight. Steve sort of reserved the limelight for himself, and all the people that made it happen kind of toiled away. They did very well, but Hotelling in any other industry would be a household name. He did all of he's credited with being the smartest guy at Apple. He did all the really interesting technical work on the iPhone, the iPad, the iWatch, the touch screen, the facial recognition technology, the medical sensors. Those are all his babies. Now, I'm not sure how much he was on the line doing this stuff the last few years, but there's always been a concern that Apple stopped being really innovative about the moment Steve Jobs died. And it hasn't been as innovative ever since. It's been a brilliant company. It's been the best run company I think I've ever seen, but the great innovations haven't been there. And all those original innovations were Steve Hotelling and his team. And with him leaving, I wonder if it's a milestone. I wonder if we'll ever see Apple as innovative as it was during those first years of the 21st century.
People said that when Johnny Ive left. Yeah, that's a lot of the core. And also in terms of the spotlight, I mean, Steve Jobs obviously loved the spotlight, but this is a company that really has a small spotlight. We didn't know about Tony Fadell until he went to Nest. We didn't know about Tim Cook really until he started to run Apple. All these people were crucial to these products, but didn't share the spotlight. And that's just sort of their culture, I guess. And can they fill those gaps? You have to. I mean, if you want your quarterback to do well, you have to have a strong offensive line, even if they're not the guys and Apple has always been able to do that, clearly. They're the most valuable company in the world, and they still have some places to fill. And this is another one of them. But again, someone who stayed that long when clearly they didn't need to, that's impressive as well.
It's impressive. And finally, and I know you read this too, at auction this week, a 1976 check signed by Steve Jobs to Radio Shack. I don't even remember how much it was, just a couple bucks, wasn't it?
I think it was $4.01.
$4.01, yes. It was expected to fetch more than $20,000 at auction. On Wednesday, it got $46,000. And I looked at the check, and it was really familiar because I know he used it at the Radio Shack on Sunnyvale, Saratoga Road at El Camino. And his bank was the Wells Fargo Bank in Los Altos, just about, I don't know, it's about 3 miles from his house. So Radio Shack, I'll finish with a story because it's very telling. Obviously, Steve Jobs used that $4 really well, and now it's the wealthiest company in the world. Radio Shack, on the other hand, did not make great use of that $4.01. In the late 1990s, I was asked to come down to Fort Worth to talk to Tandy, the parent company of Radio Shack, and to the board of directors. It was a directors meeting. And they wanted me to talk about the future. So I got up and I talked about the power of the internet, what was coming next, and e-commerce, and what we'd be able to do in 20 years thanks to Moore's Law and the internet. We'd be living and running our businesses on the internet. And they gave me a polite little applause when I got done. And I got walked out to the elevator by John Roach, the man who ran Tandy, the chairman of the board. And he clapped me on the back as the elevator's doors open. And he said, "That was a very entertaining speech. But of course, between you and me, we know that it was just all BS." And so a few years later, when Radio Shack died, and that little shop that Steve went to next to the shoe store closed its doors forever, I thought about that moment and how literally the future of the internet had been laid on the table of the board of directors of Tandy, and they didn't believe it.
Well, right. We know what happened to Radio Shack, certainly.
Yeah, and we know what happens when people think that things aren't going to change in the future, that they've got it figured out, and there's nothing major that's going to appear on the horizon and blow apart everything. And it was right there in front of them, and they missed it. Apple, on the other hand, caught the comet and has ridden it ever since.
Yep, that was a well-invested $4.01, I guess, in whatever he bought.
It's probably a not bad investment for $46,000 either.
To buy the check.
Up in price. I mean, Apple One now, they're going to auction for $1 million, $1.2 million, something like that.
Right, but that's not just Steve Jobs' signature. That's the actual machine. I'm amazed when people buy, autographed baseballs or whatever, because you're paying for a signature. Yeah. And that's impressive. That's a lot of money for a signature.
That's a lot of dough. I wonder if Wells Fargo's would still honor that check.
Doubt it.
Anyway, that's it for now, folks. You can find us on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. We're going to automate that. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to SoCon Insider, the only uncensored look at life and business in Silicon Valley and the tech world. Our host is veteran journalist and author Mike Malone. He's here with special contributor Scott Budman of NBC Bay Area. The producer is Jordan Henderson. The SoCon Insider is sponsored by Santa Clara University, located in the heart of Silicon Valley. Established in 1851, Santa Clara University is the oldest operating institution of higher learning in California. It counts among its alumni many of today's leading Silicon Valley engineers, lawyers, and executives. You can learn more about Santa Clara University at www.scu.edu.
Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye. YouTube.